A to Z Mysteries, Book Number 13, The Missing Mummy, by Ron Roy. Chapter 9. That night a thunderstorm blew through Green Lawn. While Dink slept, lightning flashed and thunder boomed outside his bedroom window. Dink had a nightmare. He was trapped in the tomb again. This time he was alone. One by one, the two mummies leaning against the wall opened their eyes. One by one, they stepped out of their coffins and shuffled toward him. They passed the child's coffin. Its lid stayed shut, the child's mask staring up at the ceiling. Because the mummy's not in there, Dink thought. But then why? Just then, Dink felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't budge. The mummy's cloth wrappings had come loose and were encircling his body like tentacles. Dink bolted awake with a yell, tangled in his sheet. When he realized that he was in his bed and not the tomb, he lay back down. He tried to go back to sleep, but something kept him awake. It was something in his nightmare, in the tomb. What was it? He lay there trying to picture the tomb again. Before the bomb went off, all three sarcophagus lids had been open. The small sarcophagus was empty because the mummy was still in Dr. Tweed's office. But after the blast, the smallest coffin, the one for the child, was closed. Then Dink remembered the robbers dragging those two heavy bags of gold. He smiled, closed his eyes, and went back to sleep. After breakfast, Dink called Josh. He came over and they walked next door to Ruth Rose's house. She was sitting on her front steps with a plate of toast on her knees. Dink sat on the bottom step. "I figured it out last night," he told them. "I know where the crooks hid the gold." Josh reached for a piece of Ruth Rose's toast, but she slapped his hand. "Don't you know it's nice to share?" he asked. "Don't you know it's nice to ask first?" Ruth Rose said. But she passed Josh a section of her toast. "Tell us, Dink." "I had an awful dream last night," Dink said. "I was trapped in the tomb. The two big coffins were open, and the mummies were chasing me. But the little coffin, the one for the kid, was closed." He looked at Josh and Ruth Rose. "After I woke up, I remembered something. When we were in the tomb, just before we got locked in, the little coffin was open, remember? But when we went back into the tomb after the bomb went off, the coffin lid was closed." "I don't get it," Josh said, licking jam from his fingers. "You will in a minute," Dink said. "I couldn't get back to sleep last night, so I started wondering, who closed that little coffin? Then it hit me. If the robbers didn't have a car waiting, and if the gold was too heavy to carry far, maybe they hid it there. Then the crook has to be someone who can get back into the tomb later and get the gold," Josh said. "Dr. Tweed!" Ruth Rose yelled. "That's what I think too," Dink said. "Aunt Frida said Dr. Tweed was a good customer. I figure he and the woman with the short dark hair planned it together." "She had that gym bag," Ruth Rose said, "and all she had to do was walk across the street." "And she smelled like a walking French fry," Josh added. "But which one hid the bomb?" Ruth Rose asked. "Dr. Tweed, I think," Dink said. "Remember how he stayed in the tomb for a few minutes after we all left?" "But why did the woman grab the mummy?" asked Josh. "To get us out of there," Dink said. "Dr. Tweed had to be alone in the tomb so he could plant the bomb." Dink grinned at Josh and Ruth Rose. "And that left the sarcophagus empty for the gold," he said. "Oh my gosh!" Ruth Rose yelled. "Dr. Tweed told us he wouldn't be at Wet Wednesday today. I'll bet he's gonna take the gold and leave." She jumped up and ran into the house. Dink and Josh were right behind her. Ruth Rose called the police station and asked for Officer Fallon. Chapter 10. Officer Fallon drove Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose to Hartford. He had called Officer Peters in Washington. The two cruisers met down the street from the museum. Officer Washington will nab the young woman in the restaurant, Officer Peters told Officer Fallon. You and I will take the museum. Kids, you come with us. Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose, flanked by the two officers, crossed Main Street and entered the quiet museum. They followed the hallway until they came to Dr. Tweed's office door. With the kids standing behind him, Officer Peters knocked. When there was no answer, he turned the knob and opened the door. Not here, he said. Officer Fallon and the kids peered into the office. They saw the little mummy lying on a table. Officer Peters looked at Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose. Let's check that tomb, he said. The kids and the two officers walked back through the lobby. They stopped in front of the closed tomb door. How do we get in? Officer Fallon asked. I know, said Josh. He pressed the secret stone, and the door slid open. Dr. Tweed was standing in front of the small sarcophagus. He whipped around, clasping a lumpy gym bag to his chest. In the sarcophagus, Dink saw a pile of gold objects. Dr. Tweed's eyes were blinking and twitching at the same time. Hello there, Officer Fallon said. Taking a trip? Dr. Tweed lunged toward the plywood-covered hole in the wall. Swinging both hands, he smashed the gym bag into the wood. The wood crunched and fell outward, and Dr. Tweed leaped through the opening. Outside, he tripped over a bag of cement and plunged into the goldfish pond. The gym bag sank to the bottom. Dr. Tweed flopped around in the shallow pond, then sat up, spitting out water. Lily pads hung from his ears and slimy algae dripped from his eyebrows. I need to call my lawyer, he sputtered. Just then, Officer Washington walked into the park. She was leading the woman from the restaurant, who wore handcuffs. So she talked? Officer Peters asked his partner. Yep, these two were supposed to take a taxi to the airport in a few minutes, Officer Washington said. Their next stop was Europe, where they hoped to sell the treasures. Take her away, Officer Peters said. I'll bring our wet friend along in a few minutes. Officer Washington led her prisoner out of the park. Officer Peters stepped into the pond and helped Dr. Tweed to his feet. He laid the wet thief against a tree and snapped handcuffs onto his gripping wrists. Officer Fallon pulled off his shoes and socks and waded into the pond. He lugged out the gym bag, filled with Egyptian treasure and pond water. Thanks for your help, Officer Peters told Officer Fallon. I'll call you later. Officer Peters picked up the heavy gym bag with a grunt. He nudged Dr. Tweed forward, and the two left the park. Their sopping shoes made squishing noises as they walked. Officer Fallon sat on a bench next to Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose. He wrung pond water from his dripping pant legs. Good job, kids, he told them. Then he pulled out his pad, opened to a fresh page, and began writing. He paused. In all the excitement, Officer Fallon said, I've forgotten what day this is. The kids grinned at each other. It's Wet Wednesday, Josh told him.